On March 18, 1957, the world you think you understand began to fracture under the weight of a classified file. How could the medical pursuit of knowledge become the blueprint for untraceable biological espionage, utilizing tiny winged spies against unsuspecting citizens? The shocking truth is that within the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the CIA, an order was issued not just to control the human mind, but to weaponize nature itself, turning common insects into tools for surveillance and, potentially, assassination. The initial flicker of this program arrived disguised as legitimate science, a research grant funneling millions across borders. It began in the quiet academic halls of the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University in Montreal, funded directly by the CIA's infamous MK-Ultra umbrella, specifically Sub-Project 68. For years, beginning in 1957, the focus was on the human mind, sensory deprivation, aggressive shock therapy, and the relentless application of LSD, a practice known chillingly as psychic driving. They wanted to break down the barriers of consciousness, but the files suggest they were also building something far more tangible. The relentless pace of this research was matched only by the secrecy surrounding it. Every new discovery in manipulating the human psyche seemed to justify the next, more ambitious leap. The groundwork for this new phase wasn't laid in Montreal, but in a separate, related effort often whispered about in secure circles, Project Acoustic Kitty. Imagine the concept: surgically implanting microphones into living cats, turning domestic pets into mobile eavesdropping devices, testing the very premise of biomechanical espionage. The groundwork laid by Acoustic Kitty, which was active throughout the 1960s, proved the engineering feasibility for something smaller, quieter, and far more pervasive. The transition was subtle but absolute. The focus shifted from what could be pumped into the human body to what could fly into a room unnoticed. Sub-Project 68 evolved. The objective was to study the effect upon the human, but now, the vector was airborne. Think of the meticulous calculations involved. Color vision is widespread among insects but varies among species, depending on the spectral sensitivities and interplay of the participating photoreceptors. They needed to know what the targets saw, or rather, what the operatives thought the targets saw, guiding the microsurveillance platforms through urban environments. The experiments were not confined to sterile laboratories. The whispers speak of field testing, of unwitting human subjects near designated drop zones, places where the agency could test the stability and range of their remote-controlled moths and other flying assets. What were the specific surveillance or assassination capabilities being tested? The official records are silent, deliberately incinerated or buried deep by 1973, when the main MK-Ultra program officially ended, years before the public discovered the scandal in 1975. Consider the mechanics of control. If you can remotely guide a creature the size of a thumbnail, you need absolute precision. This implies not just radio guidance, but complex positional feedback. Were chemical agent delivery systems being considered? Were they testing ultrasonic guidance protocols to navigate jamming frequencies? The files hint at synergy tests involving cocktails designed for dispersal upon contact with a target, a silent, airborne delivery system executed by a creature less than an inch long. The structure of the operation was built on systemic failure, a structure that allowed this expansion from mind-controlled drugs to bioweaponry to continue unchecked. Funding flowed freely for years, crossing the Atlantic, touching Canadian soil under the guise of clinical trials, all while the underlying intent remained focused on intelligence advantage. Imagine the sheer audacity, developing sophisticated guidance systems not for drones, but for creatures whose flight patterns mimic the natural chaos of the wind. The lack of oversight meant that accountability evaporated. Were any legal waivers or consent forms ever obtained for the human subjects used in these field tests during the 1960s? The investigation suggests an emphatic no. The very nature of covert, biological surveillance requires subjects who cannot testify to their involvement. The agency sought untraceable assets, and an insect, when surgically modified and remotely piloted, is the ultimate untraceable asset, until the technology fails or a subject is unexpectedly present during a test. The budget allocation for CIA remote-controlled insect surveillance remains locked away, but the related acoustic projects confirm the massive investment in weaponizing biology. The sound signatures of early remote-controlled moth prototypes, a faint high-frequency hum perhaps, were cataloged, analyzed, and then scrubbed from memory. This program represented the apotheosis of secrecy, where life itself was reduced to a programmable target. The central mystery is not just that they attempted this, but how deep the application ran after the main program was supposedly shut down in '73. Subproject 68, which began its documented life in 1957, was a testing ground. The casualty estimates for such high-risk invasive biological engineering experiments on humans are likely categorized alongside the darkest entries of the MKUltra files, suggesting severe irreversible damage or worse, all in the pursuit of a silent flying spy network. The official termination date and subsequent asset disposal sites for Subproject 68 are amongst the most zealously guarded secrets, ensuring that the whispers of flying assassins remain just that, unverified shadows in the history books. The story of MKUltra Subproject 68 proves a terrifying concept. When the pursuit of knowledge is divorced from ethics, the boundary between medicine and weaponry dissolves completely, leaving behind a legacy of invisible violation, orchestrated by the very agencies sworn to protect. Chapter 4. Collapse. The edifice of secrecy, built layer upon meticulous layer of misdirection and forged documentation, began to show its hairline fractures not through external pressure, but internal strain. The CIA, accustomed to controlling the narrative, found itself unable to contain the sheer logistical nightmare inherent in weaponizing nature. The collapse of Subproject 68 was not a neat deactivation. It was a chaotic unraveling, hastened by the inherent unreliability of biological machinery pitted against the rigid demands of military precision. The core issue, as revealed in the fragmented post-mortem reports that survived the 1973 purges, lay in the term remote control. While laboratory conditions offered fleeting moments of success, a moth briefly guided toward a specific thermal signature or a beetle steered toward a predetermined chemical plume, the real world proved recalcitrant. Insects are slaves to instinct, and the introduction of foreign stimuli, the surgical implants, the delicate antennae modifications, the constant, low-level electromagnetic field necessary for guidance, created feedback loops that often resulted in catastrophic flight failures. The field tests, rumored to have taken place in remote areas of the Nevada desert and, ironically, near decommissioned military installations in Virginia, generated horrifying data. The initial success rate for mission completion, defined as reaching a target area and remaining operational for more than 90 seconds, hovered below 1%. The rest resulted in what the internal memos clinically termed asset attrition. But attrition in this context meant thousands of bioengineered creatures dying in unpredictable ways, sometimes exploding due to internal power cell failures, sometimes simply being consumed by other insects or, most alarmingly, crashing into public spaces where recovery teams could not reach them swiftly enough. The sheer volume of recoverable, yet non-recoverable, assets became an environmental hazard unto itself. Imagine a swarm of highly specialized, surgically altered insects, each carrying miniaturized recording equipment or, worse, dispersal mechanisms, simply vanishing into the ecosystem. The fear within the agency was not exposure through a whistleblower. That was an accepted risk, but rather ecological contamination and the potential for these modified biological systems to reproduce or interact unpredictably with native populations. The pivot point toward the official termination came during a particularly disastrous test simulation in late 1971. A prototype utilizing a lacewing, modified to carry a low-yield acoustic transmitter, experienced a total guidance failure over a populated suburban area during a routine daytime flight. The lacewing, instead of following its programmed vector toward a simulated political meeting, veered wildly, crashing into a public fountain. While the agency managed to recover the creature within hours, the incident triggered an internal review that quickly escalated beyond the purview of standard operational security. It was the first time an insect asset had been verifiably lost in close proximity to unvetted, non-consenting civilians. This event forced the program's leadership, a shadowy group operating under the dual cover of entomology research and advanced telecommunications, to confront the central, fatal flaw. You cannot truly control the uncontrolled. The chaos theory inherent in insect flight dynamics rendered the precision required for espionage or assassination impossible to guarantee outside the confines of a laboratory vacuum. The dream of the airborne spy dissolved into the reality of a biological time bomb. Furthermore, the human cost associated with the development phase began to surface, albeit indirectly. The invasive surgeries required to implant the microantennae and power sources onto the insects were often replicated in early animal trials on mammals, trials which were themselves entangled with the concurrent human experimentation of MKUltra. Dr. Ewan Cameron's aggressive, often fatal, treatments at McGill were not entirely divorced from the agency's increasing desperation to understand the fragility of biological control mechanisms, whether in the human brain or an insect's nervous system. As the public scrutiny surrounding the general excesses of MKUltra intensified following the initial revelations in 1975, Congress began demanding comprehensive asset disposal manifests for all related sub-projects, effectively placing Sub-Project 68 in the crosshairs. The reaction from the CIA was predictable: aggressive scrubbing. Millions of pages of documents related to the entomological work were either shredded, cross-shredded, or subjected to controlled incineration at remote government facilities. The paper trail leading from the initial 1957 funding authorization to the disastrous 1971 field failure had to be eradicated to protect the wider intelligence framework. What remains to